Hello there. So continuing on with the Python tutorial, let's talk about strings. So strings are anything that can hold, or that anything that's encapsulated by quotes. So for example, something like with single quotes here, you could do thing, that's a string. If I wanted thing 1, 2, 3, that's a string. If I wanted to put a space in between that, let's say thing space 1, 2, 3 or 2, 3, 4, that's a string as well. Now in the same way you can assign it to a variable, so let's say var equals thing. If we look at var, we can see the string being printed out. Now let's talk about what the string is actually built on and just look at that. So I want to jump to Photoshop. So let's say you have a string called the. Now the way Python would see that is something like this. It will see it as a list. And this list is arranged like this. So let's say you have T, you have H, and you have E. Now the way Python reads lists is as items in indexed items, let's say that. So this will be the 0th item in the index, this will be the first item in the index, and this will be the second item in the index. So generally these indexes and lists start from 0, so that's why we put 0 there. So when you think of strings, think of this thing as being in a form of a list. So if we jump back into shell, and let's say we wanted to grab the first item of that variable. So let's say var, so we want to store this into a variable, the, and let's say we want to get the first item. So we know that T is the 0th item and we want to pull that as data. So let's say var, we're then going to use square braces and we're going to say 0, and that returns us the first item in that string. Now we can go back and change it and say var 1 and pull that one out. Now one thing to note is that you can't actually change these values. So if I wanted to say something like var 1 and I wanted to change this to something like y, I can't do that. In Python, strings are considered immutable, which means they cannot change. So if I wanted to change the string, I would have to physically have to assign a new value to var. So in this case it would be TYE, and then my var value is that. So if I said var 1, it pulls the y. So that's one thing to bear in mind. One other thing to bear in mind is the listing format. So we'll get into lists on another tutorial, but let's just keep this simple. So in lists you can do stuff like specify index placements and how much of the list you want. So let's say I want to get the first item up to the 0th item up to the first item. I can do something like this. One moment. Yeah, so I can do something like that. So what that means is I'm getting everything from the 0th item up to the second item, but not including that. So remember, we're starting from 0. So this will be 0, that would be 1, and that would be 2. So we're saying get 0, so from here all the way up till 2, but not including 2. So that just means that. And this has different types of flavors. So you could have let's make a longer string first. So let's say var equals thing, and then let's say we want to get var and we want everything from the 5th element upwards. That's not very clear, is it? Let's try that again. Let's say 6th element and upwards, and that will return us everything from the 6th element, which I assume is here, upwards. And you can do the same thing going down. So you could say I want everything from the 5th element downwards. So you could say again, not very clear, is it? Should have thought of that. So 6 element going downwards. So you can see it brings me everything from that below. You can also do stuff like give me the last element. So that should return the very last element, and you can do that by saying var -1, and that will give you the very last element. And again, if you want to go second last, you can say -2, and that will bring the second last element. So these list endings, as you get used to working with lists, you'll get more comfortable using them. You can also use different quotes. So for example, you could use double quotes to reference a string. And you may have cases where you have something like that. And in this case, you can't use single strings because the program's just confused about what you're doing. So you would have to do something like double quotes, and that way you can surround everything, even the single quote, which is what you want, there too. So you can see how it prints out with a double quote, a thing, and a single quote, an S, and a double quote, and you can do stuff like that. You can also do triple quotes, and that's useful if you are doing something like moving to a different line. So let's say I went thing, I make a new line and say thing, word, and then I end that with a triple quote again. And you can see that this new line ending has been changed with the notation of \n. Now what that means is it's the string equivalent of saying a new line. So if you want to reference a new line, the computer code will recognize that as a \n, as a new line. We also have concatenation, so that's when you want to combine strings together. So let's say we have a string like s1 equals 1, and then s2 equals dog. Now if you want to join these two together, you can say plus that, you can say s1 plus s2, 1 dog. Now obviously if you want to make it more grammatically correct, you want to put a space in between them, which you can do. So if you leave an empty string with a space in it, and then you put s2, you can see that concatenation happens and puts it together. Now you may have concatenations with numbers, and you may want to do that. So if you have a number, let's say number equals 5.0, and then we want to concatenate that with s1, if we just did it as it was, it will throw an error because it's of a different type. So number is of type float, and it's not a string. So classes come into play here. Now if you want to make number act as the same as a string, you would have to do something called casting. So that would be something like you get the variable, you get the class name, you surround it with quotes, and then you enter the parameter or value that you want to cast into that. So in this case I want to get the number, which is a float, cast it to a string, and you can see we've done that. So let's say we want to do that again. And then here you can see 1 has been concatenated with an actual number that's been converted into a string. Okay, so I think that covers most of strings. I'll end this here and I'll catch you in the next tutorial. Bye bye.